Mr. Harris, the floor is yours.
Uh, good, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here presenting a jointly written paper with some of my Jamaican colleagues, some in the United States. So initially we started off with a cool title because we're all Jamaicans, so we said Cool Runnings or Rough Road, the Jamaica Debt Reform, Stabilize the Budget, but Strain the People. And recently, very recently, as we go through the process of submitting to journals, we decided to, change the title to what you see now on your program. Um, Sorry, how do we? Okay, good. So let's start off with some economic history as it relates to Jamaica. So once dubbed the Pearl of the Caribbean, Jamaica experienced significant growth prior in the first 5 or so years post-independence. And this growth averaged around 5.2%. But after this decade, Jamaica experienced several shocks, and these range from political and economic shocks to IMF structural adjustment programs, financial crisis, economic crisis, environmental crisis. And we most recently had another hurricane, as you would have known. So, continuing with the economic history that for Jamaica, between 1970 to 2010, we also had a complex and troubling history with the IMF. We entered multiple IMF agreements with the aim of achieving economic stabilization. We had several standby agreements, extended fund facility, and these were all austerity and structural reforms measures, which led to some criticism locally about worsening condition. But Jamaica experienced significant debt. Our debt to GDP ratio was 141.9% in 2019, which ranked us as one of the most highly indebted countries in the world. And to put things into perspective, our interest payment was around 52 cents for every non-grant revenue, or 17% of GDP. So by 2009, Jamaica was characterized as a country with high government debt, constrained social spending, and stagnant growth. So what did we do? Well, we turned to the IMF, and so we entered an IMF standby agreement. And so in 2010, we got a 1.27 billion US dollar loan to support our plan to recover from the mounting government debt, the weak economic growth we're experiencing, and of course the economic effects of the global financial crisis. So this program came with certain stipulations. For example, reform in the public sector in the form of wage freeze, reducing the budget deficit, and lowering the debt servicing costs. It also came with the stipulation to increase government tax revenue, that is, to the equivalent of 2% of GDP, and introduce a debt exchange program to achieve around 3% of GDP, as well as reducing the debt maturity. Also, the privatization of some assets and strengthening the fiscal and monetary framework. Complementary to that was also what we call the Jamaica Debt Exchange Program. And so this program was introduced around in January 2010. And what it really aimed to do was to get bondholders to exchange the bonds that they currently hold for other bonds that had lower interest rate and longer maturity. And again, the goal of this was to free up funds for growth as well as reduce interest payment. And we had a pretty successful participation, with 95% of bondholders actually participating. And so this graph really kind of show you how the debt has really shifted for Jamaica over that time. But while we're into that program, we didn't see much turnaround for Jamaica. And so we turned to the IMF again in 2013 and to get another loan. And this one was extended fund facility loan. equivalent to 932 million US dollars. And again, this program came with some stipulations, such in particular fiscal reform, where we had to introduce a 5-year public sector investment program, and also tax reform to modernize the tax system and limit exemptions, as well as lower tax rate. Also introduced another debt exchange program, and this one was called the National Debt Exchange. And so this program was pretty similar, but centered on the voluntary exchange of bonds. And so the focus was to achieve some level of fiscal saving and public financial management improvements. So the government during this period was targeting a primary surplus of around 7.5% of GDP, which was one of the highest in the world. For example, compared to Greece, which was a country that was highly indebted as well, but was required to achieve 3% of GDP there. But what was also new during this period was that Jamaica implemented some accountability framework, right? So in particular, we had a committee, shortened EPOC. It's the Economic Program Oversight Committee in 2010. And the aim of this committee was to monitor the economic reform measures under the IMF program. And this committee was comprised of varying individuals from the public and private sector, the Ministry of Finance, for example, the Central Bank, civil society. Jamaica also had fiscal rules in the form of limiting the annual fiscal deficit of the public sector, and this exists even today, with the aim of reducing the public debt to no more than 60% by 2020, fiscal year 2025-2026. So just to kind of show you what has really taken place. So we see prior to the first IMF program and debt exchange program, we see that Jamaica's debt, the evolution of it was increasing. And between the two, between 2010 and 2013, it kind of stabilized a bit. And then we see a complete turnaround after the second debt exchange program and the second IMF loan program. And so this has really kind of made us become a poster child for the IMF, where in 2010, these are from local and international newspapers. You know, so we see we got a lot of attention from both IMF, the Financial Times, you know, and yes. So we became quite recognized then. So this led us to ask a question, right? So against this background, we want to try to study the impact of this debt exchange program, and in particular on the national debt, unemployment and income prices, and health and education. And we do this using macro level data and micro level data. So we had a lot of information in the paper, which unfortunately I don't think I can present everything today, but I want to give you the main points of it. And so while there are a few studies that have looked at this, they are descriptive in nature. And I highlight one here, Arsenal, last year, right? But our paper in particular is the first to examine the causal impact of Jamaica's debt exchange pro-intervention, and to also explore the short-term and longer-term impact of the intervention on Jamaica's debt exchange, and other key macroeconomic effects. We also utilize the budgeting data to explore the mechanism through which this debt has been reduced. So how did we do this? We got some data from varying sources. We got from the Ministry of Finance, the World Bank and the IMF. In particular, we got information from the national debt, unemployment and income prices, health and education. And our sample was restricted to countries without an IMF agreement between 2000 and 2019. I'll explain why that's the case shortly. Our sample size included 61 countries and a total of 915 observations. And this vary across different income categories or classification. We had 34 upper income countries, 14 upper middle income countries, and 13. And we found that our results was robust, as you will see shortly across these categories. So, in terms of to give a descriptive analysis for our paper, in general, there are several ways a country could reduce their national debt. They can increase revenue, they can reduce expenditure, they can grow out of the debt, or they can restructure the debt. And so we examine which of these mechanisms really contribute the most to Jamaica's debt reduction. So we do this using, in particular, the synthetic control method. In particular, we use the synthetic control method and the synthetic difference in difference method to examine this causal impact of the intervention. And we do this over three, what we call average treatment on the treatment effect estimates here. We look at it from the JDX and the SBA, which were the first in 2010, and then the NDX and the EFF, and then the overall results there, the average effect. And so the main advantage of using this synthetic difference in difference, in addition to SCM, is really to identify the ATET under the conditional parallel trend assumption. And it also blends the features of both the difference in difference and the synthetic control, and also generate a greater robustness. So a little bit more on this. So as I said, we use the synthetic control method, and this method is important as it helps us to estimate the effect of the Jamaica debt structuring intervention on the several outcomes. And it has been applied across using different applications across the literature. For example, legalized prostitution, the labor market effects of the Mariel boat lift, the rights to carry, minimum wage, and also IMF stabilization program there. Right, so this is a data-driven procedure, and what it does is try to construct a control group from a donor pool where we have untreated countries, which is why we restricted the sample to countries that didn't have an IMF program during that period. Right, and so the method also explicitly illustrates the way that each control unit contributes to what we call the counterfactual, right? And really show the similarities and dissimilarities between the treated unit and the synthetic group. So as I mentioned, we look across these four categories, and I'll show these results shortly. A key thing that I want to establish before, because the paper had so many results, I'll just show the one for gross debt, which is similar for the rest of the results. One key thing we have to see for these results is that prior to the first intervention, that is 2010, if you notice that the control and the treated trends are quite similar. This is important as this suggests that there's a good matching. And therefore, anything after the intervention would be due to the intervention itself, suggesting causal effect. So what were the results that we find in this paper? First, we looked at gross debt, right? How did this debt intervention reduce Jamaica's debt? And we see from our full sample that this reduced the debt by approximately 37 percentage points, this debt intervention program. We also carry out some robustness checks where we look at it from this subsample point of view of the upper middle and high income countries, the highly indebted countries, and also for the synthetic difference in difference. And across all subsamples and across the synthetic difference, you see that this result is quite similar, suggesting robustness of our main results here, of our baseline result. So what was really the mechanism through which this occurred? Well, when we look across the different categories, as I mentioned before, we can reduce the debt. In terms of reducing the debt, we can reduce expenditure, increase revenue, or growth of it, or restructure. Well, in this case, what we see from our main results is that the reduction in the debt for Jamaica is really due to cuts in government expenditure. And so this reduction is due, one, to wages and recurring and capital expenditure, and as such, increase in the revenue really increased revenue outpace the yielding higher primary surplus there. So these were some kind of what we called intended effects. But what we were considering when discussing and writing this paper were what were some of the unintended effects, right? We wanted to reduce the debt, sure, but did it come at some type of cost? And so the first category that we looked at was the one with unemployment and income. And the measures that are in this category are one, unemployment, overall unemployment rate and youth unemployment rate as labor force participation rate, GDP per capita. And what we see mainly is that unemployment and youth unemployment were increased here, while GDP per capita as a measure of income, average income, declined, but of course was outpaced by remittances. What about prices? In this category, we had exchange rate, the CPI, and the interest rate. And we see that in both phases of the intervention, this led to a depreciation in the exchange rate, right? Relative to the US dollar. So we use Jamaica to US dollar here for exchange rate, and you see that average around 20%. Concurrently with this, we find that the relative control group, that CPI fell by around 2%, but this was, of course, statistically insignificant. This was not different from zero. And the results really showed also an increase in the interest rate here of 4.97%. So we also looked at health and education. And so for these, we use 5 different categories. We saw no impact on health expenditure. Life expectancy, however, declined by 1.6 years, and the old dependency ratio fell by, old dependency ratio fell by 0.5 years, and the youth dependency ratio decreased by 3.38 there on average. And so this is really consistent with what we saw in terms of the higher mortality rate among the elderly and worsening birth and infant health, which really a decrease, and also a decrease in fertility rate there. So another question that we asked ourselves was whether or not these results were short-term or long-term. And so what I'm showing right here is the dynamic trend of these results. Right? So what we saw earlier was just the average effect. Here I'm showing whether these are permanent or transitory effect. And so we saw for the national debt that this appears to be a permanent decline in national debt. I think this year as well we have made record of actually beating our target for the national debt, the debt target that we have. Right? We also see the government, for government expenditure, it has declined. It's trending up, but it's still below the baseline there. Right? For government expenditure, government revenue, we did see a decline, but we see that that effect is transitory there, no effect. Similar results for the growth rate. For the interest rate, we see a more permanent there, but a little bit noisy as well. Exchange rate, we saw depreciation in the exchange rate, where that appears to not be transitory. Unemployment rate, that appears to not be permanent. Yes, we had an increase, but it has been on the downward trend there. And for GDP per capita, that was transitory. Looking at life expectancy, we see a decline there, but it appears to be trending up. Again, for youth dependency, we see a decline. And those are most of our results that I want to show here. But what we have seen to kind of conclude here is that the debt restructuring program effectively reduced the national debt, right? But it did come at some social cost, right? And so what this really showed is that we went through a program which really turned around the country, right? We had a historic and sustained cuts in government spending through the decline in wages, capital, and recurring expenses, really boosting the primary surplus. But and also the debt restructuring of the country, debt obligation. We had less debt, lower interest payment, but there's also was a slight increase in government revenue, but no change in GDP. So we really also saw some several unplanned effects. We saw improved political stability.
Mr. Harris, I'm getting the signal for you too.
All right, so improvement in political stability, and higher interest rate. So overall, this paper for us really showed that there needs to be a delicate balance between a country's action to reduce debt and the unplanned effects or unplanned social costs that may come. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harris, for your interesting perspective. So please join us here for further discussion. Daifa, floor is yours.
Thank you, Jason. First of all, congratulations on your paper and thank you for your presentation. I'll start by providing some comments and then some suggestions and later on my question. So this paper is highly relevant because it addresses a critical issue, and that is the trade-off between fiscal sustainability and social welfare in highly indebted countries. It's also relevant because most Caribbean countries have a debt to GDP ratio higher than 60%. So I applaud you for that. This paper uses an SCM and an SDID model, which are appropriate for causal interference and single country interventions. This paper also checks for robustness by using alternative donor pools who strengthen the credibility of the paper. This paper also makes use of national budget data with international data sets from, for example, IMF and the World Bank, and it also includes both macroeconomic indicators and social outcomes such as education, health, and unemployment. This paper also has a balanced narrative since it uses both fiscal success and since it highlights both fiscal success and social costs. What I also liked is that you mentioned that in 2025, Jamaica implemented an independent fiscal commission to strengthen the country's institutional economic framework. So I think it's really good that countries actually take advantage of the intervention and take notes of the positive results and implement them in order to strengthen their economic framework. I'll now move on to my suggestions. The literature review was quite extensive, but I would suggest you consider grouping studies into teams. So for example, IMF effectiveness or debt thresholds or even social impacts of interventions. Also, moving on to the results, I would suggest discussing heterogeneity. So specify which groups, which social groups were mostly affected by these interventions. I will give you an example. You can take urban versus rural, or even gender beyond secondary enrollment. Moving on to policy implications, I would suggest looking at alternative or even mentioning alternative fiscal paths that could have mitigated the social costs of the intervention. So that brings me to my question to you, and that is that unfortunately Jamaica has recently been hit by Hurricane Melissa, and studies show that natural disasters increase the debt to GDP ratio. So there's a chance that Jamaica will need to adopt a program for debt restructuring again. And in your paper, you mentioned that a less aggressive fiscal target might have reduced the associated socioeconomic impact after the intervention. So my question to you is, what should the government do differently now? Or even better yet, what do you recommend doing? That was my feedback for you. And once again, thank you very much and well done.
Mr. Harris, would you like a little time? We take questions from the floor? Or you want to go directly to? Okay. And if there's anyone, that has some comments, questions, suggestions? We have a couple minutes. No? Anyone? There we go.
I just have one question. Tracy Maynard, Central Bank of Barbados. I was just wondering, in terms of the impact of the debt restructuring on his variables, the social variables, did he see, did you see the impact in terms of the declining trend in those macro variables before before Jamaica actually went into the program with the IMF? Did those negative trends still existed prior to that?
It's up to you. If you'd like to.
Okay.
I think one at a time is better.
I can answer now.
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much for those questions. Thank you very much for reading the paper. I hope it wasn't too much. I know there's quite a bit of graphs, and I'm grateful for your comments, and we'll definitely look into that. In terms of yeah, the hurricane. So Hurricane Melissa, yeah, did hit us a couple weeks ago, and when it hit, one of the first questions that crossed my mind was, I wonder what's going to happen in terms of the debt. Fortunately, our former Minister of Finance, we had I think a climate respond. My colleagues can back me up as to the correct name, but so we do have, it was triggered, the CRIF, right? And so we will get some funds there. And I mean, from the local and international community, we have been getting quite a bit of aid. The Prime Minister has said that the damage is around maybe 6 to 7 billion US dollars. So, I mean, maybe it's early days now to know whether or not we will really need to, how much we will actually need to go to the IMF. But I know there's a kind of also escape clause in terms of the fiscal rule. But we have a governing framework to ensure that we do not go back to that place again. So it's not as if we can operate and either spend as much as we want necessarily, right? So we have some rules to abide by there. In terms of what we should advise the government to do. Funny you asked that question because I was trying to avoid it, to be honest. I was trying to avoid not telling the government necessarily what to, but it's part of research, to be honest, because we didn't want to make this paper a political one. We really just wanted to analyze what was this effect rather than getting to the policy, which is why we said in our policy prescription that we have to really consider what the policy implication may be. Are we really wanting to make this go through the social costs again? We saw the high unemployment rate, we saw GDP per capita going down. Back then we saw wage freeze. I don't think anybody like when their wage is frozen, right? You can't have any wage increase for a while. So it's that whether or not we can actually do that, and even if the government can convince the population, yeah. In terms of to my colleague from Central Bank of Barbados, right, Tracy? Yeah, right. So in terms of whether we observe these trends prior for the social cost, so I guess like for example unemployment rate, if we saw a decline. Oh, let me be speedy. Sorry. Yeah, we didn't see that decline. I can double check, but our aim was to kind of really see compared to the counterfactual, that is what would have been, right? So we have these other countries, their unemployment rate, and we have Jamaica's unemployment rate. So what we're trying to see is if we didn't go under this debt intervention program, what would our unemployment rate be? And so relative to that synthetic Jamaica, what would have been, that's really what we're trying to aim to say. All right? Hope that helps to answer your question.
Because you spoke about, I think you also spoke about declining fertility rates, um, life expectations decline, a lot of negative social consequences, just not just the unemployment, but you also had spoke about all these other things. So that's
Okay,
why
yeah.
that is what jogged my.
So for the fertility and the mortality rate, we didn't implicitly take that into the model, but we did look at those trends, yes, after. And we did see that there was a decline in those, yes.
Okay, I think we're quite close to time anyway, and I'd like to thank both of you for your insightful comments and the lively discussion. Thank you very much.